NASA is preparing its next major mission, Artemis II, a journey that will send humans farther into space than we've gone in over 50 years. In today's discussion, we're breaking down what this mission is, how it works, and why it matters. Listen to the conversation between Orion and Nova as they explore every part of this mission and decide for yourself what it means for the future of space. Let's get into it.
I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you're packing your bags for a highly specialized camping trip.
Okay, a camping trip sounds fun.
Right, but there's a catch. If the sun happens to shine a little too brightly while you're out there, you have roughly 3 minutes to build a makeshift fort out of your own water bladders and food supplies.
Wow.
3 minutes.
Yeah, and if you don't build it fast enough or thick enough, you die.
That is terrifying.
It is, and the craziest part is that isn't some hypothetical thought experiment.
Right.
That is the exact literal reality of the mission we are looking at today in this deep dive.
It really is.
Because we have to talk about something that feels almost universally misunderstood right now.
Yeah.
You look back at the year 1969.
Right, a massive year.
A year practically burned into our collective human memory. I mean, that was the year we did the impossible. We walked on the moon.
We actually left footprints in the dust.
Exactly. We looked up at this celestial body that had been the subject of myth and poetry for millennia, and we actually touched it. And then we just stopped. It is a staggering reality to confront, honestly, when you lay it out plainly like that.
It really is.
Because there's this pervasive, almost comforting illusion that we are currently this deeply spacefaring species.
Right, you see it in movies all the time.
Yeah. And in one highly specific sense, we are, but purely by proxy.
By proxy? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, we have built incredible orbital laboratories. We've sent highly advanced robotic rovers to carve tracks into the regolith of Mars.
Oh, sure. The machines are out there.
Right. We have launched these unimaginably complex, cryogenically cooled telescopes that are out there right now. They're parked at Lagrange points, peering into the very edge of the observable universe.
Showing us the dawn of time, basically.
Exactly. But the robots are doing all the heavy lifting.
Yeah, the machines, the titanium proxies, they get to go out into the deep dark while we stay safely huddled right next to the porch light.
That's a great way to put it.
Because for more than half a century, no human being has traveled farther than low Earth orbit.
Not one.
We had this massive civilization-defining buildup, this incredible leap forward, and then we parked the cars in the driveway and decided not to leave the neighborhood.
Yeah. And, low Earth orbit is essentially just skimming the very top of our atmosphere.
Right. It's not deep space.
Not at all. We have not pushed the boundaries of human physical endurance in the cosmos since the Apollo era.
Well, until right now.
Exactly.
Until right now.
Which brings us to the core focus of today's deep dive into the source material. We are looking at the architecture, the psychology, and the raw physics of NASA's Artemis II mission.
Artemis II. It is huge.
Because NASA is currently preparing to send humans farther from Earth than anyone in recorded history.
Yes. But we have to clear something up immediately because the public perception of the Artemis program is heavily skewed.
Oh, definitely.
When people hear the words Artemis and moon, the immediate mental image is a lunar lander touching down, dust kicking up, astronauts stepping out to plant a flag.
Right, like the direct sequel to Apollo 11.
Precisely what it is not. Okay, so what is it then?
Artemis II is explicitly not about landing on the moon. Going to the moon, physically touching the surface, is no longer the true frontier challenge.
Because we already did that.
Right. We proved the orbital mechanics and the descent propulsion required to do that back in the 20th century.
Okay.
The real challenge today, the actual hurdle keeping us from becoming a multiplanetary species, is learning how to stay there.
Oh, not just visiting, staying.
Yes. Artemis II is the foundational proof of concept for human survival in the modern era of deep space exploration.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of this. If the goal isn't to just touch the surface, grab some rocks, and run back home, what are we actually trying to prove?
It's a survival test.
Right. The thesis of Artemis II seems to boil down to one brutal question. Can humans travel 400,000 kilometers, operate complex machinery in an environment that is actively trying to kill them, and actually make it back alive?
That is the exact question.
The best way I can wrap my head around this is to think about submarines.
Oh, I like this analogy.
So imagine you have this brand new, incredibly advanced, never-before-tested submarine, and your ultimate goal is to build a permanent, pressurized research station at the absolute bottom of the Mariana Trench.
The deepest part of the ocean.
Exactly. You wouldn't just load up a crew, drive out to the middle of the Pacific, and drop straight down to the ocean floor on day one.
Because if you don't test it halfway down first, a microfracture at the bottom of the trench isn't just an anomaly, it's a lethal, catastrophic implosion.
Right. You cannot test deep water pressure dynamics in a shallow pool.
You really can't.
You have to take that submarine out into the deep water first. You submerge it halfway. You listen to the metal groan.
You monitor the acoustic signatures of the hull.
Yes. You test the life support systems under the actual crushing pressure of the journey to see if the machine and the people inside it can handle the environment before you ever attempt to touch the bottom.
And that is exactly what Artemis II is. It is that midwater pressure test. It is taking the submarine out over the deepest trench and pushing the hull to its absolute limits. It's proving the vessel can survive the crushing reality of deep space before we even think about setting up a permanent camp on the lunar surface.
That makes perfect sense.
And that is the exact framework required to understand the mission profile. Because to prove that humans can survive the deep space environment, you first have to build a machine capable of violently ripping them away from Earth's gravity well.
Violently ripping. Yeah, that takes some serious power.
It requires a level of kinetic energy that is difficult to conceptualize.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the launch architecture, the Space Launch System, or SLS.
The SLS, the machine that does the ripping. We are talking about raw, unadulterated power here.
Absolutely massive power.
At liftoff, this rocket generates more thrust than any current operational rocket designed for humans.
It's staggering.
The architecture relies heavily on two massive solid rocket boosters that flank the sides of the central core stage. And these aren't just, supplementary fireworks.
No, not at all.
Each of those solid rocket boosters produces millions of pounds of thrust on its own. They provide the vast majority of the brute force needed to get this massive vehicle off the launch pad and punch through the thickest part of the lower atmosphere.
And we really have to understand the nature of solid rocket boosters. Because once you ignite solid propellant, there is no throttle.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
You can't turn it down.
No. There is no off switch. It is a highly controlled, sustained explosion that burns until the fuel is entirely exhausted.
Wow. You are committed.
Completely committed, but they aren't working alone. Alongside those two solid boosters, the core stage is powered by a cluster of 4 RS-25 engines.
Okay, the RS-25s.
All right, and these engines operate on a completely different physical principle. They burn a cryogenic mixture of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen.
Now, here's where I want to look closer, because the engineering philosophy here is totally fascinating.
Oh, it really is.
The RS-25 is the exact same engine design that was used on the space shuttle.
Yes, a legacy design.
Right. And the space shuttle was a vehicle famously designed strictly for low Earth orbit. It was a space truck that never left our planetary backyard.
Right, it stayed close to home.
So, looking at the physics and the mission goals, why are we using a legacy design from a low Earth orbit vehicle to push humans farther into deep space than ever before?
It's a great question.
It just feels counterintuitive to bolt a 1970s engine block onto a vehicle meant to pioneer the 21st century deep space frontier.
It does feel counterintuitive, until you look at the fluid dynamics and the sheer mechanical stress of reaching escape velocity.
Okay, explain that.
Well, when you are attempting to push human beings deeper into the void than anyone has ever gone, the absolute last thing you want is a completely untested theoretical engine design.
You don't want surprises.
Exactly. The RS-25 is an engineering marvel precisely because of its staged combustion cycle. It takes cryogenic liquid hydrogen, which has to be stored at almost absolute zero, right? And liquid oxygen. It pumps them at terrifying pressures into a combustion chamber and sustains that controlled detonation for minutes on end.
That's incredible.
The turbopunks inside those engines are generating tens of thousands of horsepower just to move the fuel.
So it's not about using old tech, it's about using the most violently tested tech in human history.
Yes, exactly. You do not want surprises when you are riding millions of pounds of high explosives.
You do not.
The RS-25 has a deeply proven track record of immense power, regenerative cooling efficiency, and critically reliability over decades of flight data.
It works.
It works beautifully.
Right.
The sheer proven specific impulse, the efficiency of the thrust needed to achieve the velocity required for deep space, makes that legacy design invaluable.
Okay, That makes total sense now.
It is the most reliable, highly understood mechanism available to ensure the crew actually survives the initial brutal climb out of Earth's gravity well.
Okay, so the SLS provides the muscle. It's the reliable engine block for the cross-country desert race.
Perfect analogy.
But let's move to the very top of this massive, shaking tower of fire. That is where the Orion spacecraft sits.
The crew module.
Right. This is the actual habitat. For up to 3 weeks, this capsule is their entire universe. It is their dining room, their bathroom, their laboratory, and their life raft.
And if we look at Orion through the lens of the Apollo capsules from the 1960s, the evolution in aerospace engineering is just striking.
Oh, it's got to be totally different.
It is. Orion is significantly larger by volume. It is infinitely more advanced in terms of avionics. And crucially, it is designed from the ground up for long-duration deep space missions.
Unlike Apollo.
Right. Apollo carried 3 astronauts in incredibly cramped quarters. I mean, it was tiny. Orion's is designed to sustain a crew of 4, with the internal volume required to actually manage the psychological and physical realities of a multi-week mission.
And it's not just about giving them more legroom.
No, not at all.
Orion is equipped with highly advanced autonomous navigation systems that don't rely solely on ground control.
That's a massive upgrade.
Right. And the life support systems are fundamentally different from what we use in low Earth orbit. They have to scrub carbon dioxide and manage humidity with systems that are designed for the unique, unresupplyable hazards of deep space travel.
Because there's no cargo ship coming to drop off fresh filters.
Exactly. The hardware has to be scalable. If Artemis II works, the same baseline capsule design has to eventually support missions to the Lunar Gateway Station and eventually Mars transit architectures.
But, before any of that deep space capability even matters, before the autonomous navigation calculates a single trajectory, or the amine beds scrub a single molecule of carbon dioxide, there is a much more immediate primal hurdle.
Oh, what's that?
The crew has to survive the launch itself.
Right. And this brings us to the terrifying reality of the ascent.
It is terrifying.
We just described millions of pounds of thrust, burning liquid hydrogen and solid rocket fuel. It is an intricate choreography of controlled explosions.
Intricate and violent.
But what happens if that explosion suddenly becomes uncontrolled? What if a turbopump shatters or a solid booster burns through its casing?
That is the nightmare scenario.
The architecture includes something called the launch abort system, and the physics of how this operates are genuinely intense.
It is the ultimate brute force insurance policy.
How does it work?
Well, at the very top of the Orion spacecraft, essentially forming a spire above the crew module, sits the launch abort system.
Okay, right at the tip.
Right. If the SLS rocket begins to fail during ascent, if the onboard computers detect a catastrophic drop in pressure, an anomalous vibration, or an impending structural failure, this system does not ask mission control for permission.
It just goes.
It activates autonomously and instantly.
I was trying to picture the sheer violence of this. It's an ejection seat, but not for a single pilot in a fighter jet.
No, it's much bigger than that.
Imagine an ejection seat for an entire building. You have 4 people strapped inside a heavy, shielded room, and you ignite solid rocket motors on the roof of that room to rip it away from a collapsing skyscraper beneath it.
That is exactly what it is.
You are pulling the entire crew capsule violently up and away from a massive fireball.
And violently is the correct physical description.
Yeah.
We are talking about pulling astronauts away from a failing rocket at accelerations that induce massive G-loads on the human body.
That's a hurt.
It's brutal. The abort motors have to generate enough immediate explosive thrust to physically outrun a shockwave. Within milliseconds of the abort motors firing, the capsule is pulled far enough away to clear the blast radius.
And then what?
Once it reaches a safe altitude and distance, the abort motor assembly jettisons, and the capsule transitions into an aggressive, unpowered ballistic trajectory, relying on its parachutes to slam the brakes on and trap them safely back to Earth.
It perfectly illustrates a fundamental irony of spaceflight, doesn't it?
How so?
Sometimes the only way to guarantee safety is to execute a highly controlled, brain-rattling explosion in the exact opposite direction of the danger.
That is so true.
It is their only way out if the physics of the SLS stack fail on the pad or in the lower atmosphere.
Which naturally requires us to examine the human element of this equation.
Right, the people inside.
We can discuss turbo pumps and solid rocket propellant all day, but the machine is ultimately only as capable as the biological operators inside it.
I really want you, listening right now, to put yourself in their flight suits. Think about the psychological profile required here.
It takes a very specific kind of person.
You are looking up at a machine taller than a skyscraper. You know exactly the megatons of explosive yield sitting inside those fuel tanks.
You know the math.
You know that you are going farther into the dark, irradiated vacuum of space than anyone in history, and you willingly strap yourself into the seat.
Willingly, that's the key word.
Because once those solid rocket boosters ignite, there is no aborting the burn of those boosters. The ground shakes, the sky lights up, and within milliseconds, you are committed.
There is no off switch.
You either reach orbit or you use the launch abort system. There is no gentle shutdown.
It requires a level of compartmentalization and risk acceptance that is, frankly, difficult for a layperson to fully grasp.
Yeah, absolutely.
You are trusting an untested deep space integration with your life. And the selection of the 4 individuals for Artemis II is a masterclass in assembling a complementary matrix of skills.
They didn't just pick names out of a hat.
No, each crew member brings a highly specific, vital capability to what is, at its core, a deep space survival and engineering test.
Let's look at this group. First, we have Reed Wiseman. He is the commander of the mission.
Right, the commander.
He is a former Navy fighter pilot, a test pilot, and a highly experienced astronaut who has already commanded complex operations in orbit.
Wiseman brings the absolute necessity of high-stakes, rapid response command.
Which you need on a test flight.
Exactly. When you are flying a test vehicle, the primary threat is not the expected environment, it is the cascading anomaly.
The domino effect of things breaking.
Right. A Navy fighter pilot's core neurological training is rooted in managing complex machinery in a lethal environment where failure happens in fractions of a second.
They are trained not to panic.
Never panic. If a sensor gives a contradictory reading or a thruster valve sticks open, you need a commander whose instinct is immediate, cold, operational discipline. He is the anchor for the crew's emergency protocols.
Okay, then we have Victor Glover, the pilot. His background is deeply tied to the commercial, modern era of spaceflight.
He's a fascinating addition.
He previously flew aboard a SpaceX Crew Dragon mission, and he was the first Black astronaut to live aboard the International Space Station for a long-duration mission.
Glover's presence bridges a critical generational gap in aerospace engineering.
How so?
Well, the Apollo and Space Shuttle eras were defined by analog switches, physical dials, and manual toggle systems.
Lots of buttons.
Lots of buttons. But the architecture of modern spacecraft, like the Crew Dragon and Orion, relies heavily on glass cockpits, deep automation, and software-driven interfaces.
Oh, like touchscreens.
Yes. Glover's recent long-duration experience piloting these modern, touchscreen, algorithm-heavy commercial systems makes him uniquely qualified to pilot Orion. He speaks the language of modern spacecraft automation.
That makes a ton of sense. Next is Christina Koch, serving as a mission specialist. And her physiological data is just astonishing.
It really is unparalleled.
She holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman. She spent 328 consecutive days in orbit.
Nearly a year.
That is nearly a full year of her life spent in microgravity, physically locked inside a machine, relying on fans and filters for every breath she took.
And that biological reality is profoundly important for Artemis II.
Because it's a long mission.
Exactly. We are testing deep space endurance. The human body undergoes radical changes in microgravity osteoclasts. Break down bone density, bodily fluids shift entirely to the upper body, the optic nerve swells.
It's hard on the body.
Very hard. So who better to evaluate the life support systems, the exercise protocols, and the psychological strain of deep space confinement than someone who holds a monumental endurance record?
She knows what to look for.
Koch brings an unparalleled, visceral understanding of how a human body and mind interact with a closed-loop life support system over a massive duration. She doesn't just know how the system works on paper. She knows what it smells like, what it sounds like, and how it feels when it has been keeping you alive for 10 months.
That is invaluable experience. And then we have the final member of the crew, Jeremy Hansen. He's a mission specialist representing Canada.
Yes, the Canadian representative.
And when you look at his resume, one glaring fact stands out. He has never been to space.
He hasn't.
He has never left Earth. He is a rookie. So look at this from a risk management perspective. Why on earth would NASA send someone who has never even experienced the onset of microgravity on a mission that is going farther into deep space than almost any human in history?
Sounds wild, doesn't it?
It seems like an enormous variable to introduce onto the ultimate test drive.
It does seem counterintuitive. You would assume you want a crew composed entirely of seasoned veterans for a mission with historical risk levels.
Right.
But this is where we have to remember the scientific and medical objectives of a test flight. If you only send astronauts whose neurovestibular systems, their inner ears, their spatial orientation mapping have already adapted to microgravity over multiple missions, you're collecting skewed biomedical data.
Oh, wow. I didn't think of that.
Their brains have already built the neural pathways to process spaceflight.
Ah, their brains are already pre-programmed to ignore the conflicting signals of zero gravity. They don't get space sickness the same way a rookie does because their body remembers the environment.
Exactly. Hansen brings the invaluable asset of a completely unacclimated physiological baseline.
A blank slate.
Yes, a clean slate. His body has never experienced sustained zero gravity. His brain has never had to process the sensory input of leaving the planet's gravitational pull.
So they want to see how he reacts.
For the aerospace medicine teams monitoring the telemetry, having a clean slate human react to the onset of microgravity, the specific vibration profile of the SLS launch, and the transition into deep space conditions is a goldmine of data.
Because eventually, normal people might go.
Right. Future Artemis missions will eventually carry geologists, physicists, and specialists who may not have decades of fighter pilot or spaceflight experience.
That makes perfect sense.
Hansen is the vital control subject. He proves whether the vehicle is tolerable for a first-time flyer.
So his lack of experience is actually a highly calibrated scientific instrument for the mission that completely recontextualizes his role.
It really does.
Okay, so we have the SLS stack, we have the Orion escape systems, and we have the crew matrix. Let's get into the orbital mechanics of the journey itself.
The flight path.
Because once they survive the intense violence of the launch and the solid boosters fall away, they don't just point the nose at the moon and hit the accelerator.
No, they can't do that.
They have to prove the ship actually works before they sever their final tether to Earth.
This brings us to the first major operational phase of the mission profile. After the core stage shuts down and separates, Orion uses its interim cryogenic propulsion stage to enter a highly elliptical orbit around Earth.
And let's break down why an elliptical orbit is so crucial here. It's an oval.
Right, an oval shape.
At its perigee, its lowest point, it keeps them relatively close to the atmosphere. But at its apogee, its highest point, it stretches tens of thousands of kilometers out into space.
It essentially acts as a high-stakes waiting room.
A waiting room, I like that.
You're exposing the spacecraft to the deep thermal cycling of space, but you haven't committed to the translunar trajectory yet. You are still gravitationally bound to Earth in a way that allows for a low delta V abort if something goes critically wrong.
Delta V being the measure of the impulse needed to perform a maneuver.
Exactly. In this highly elliptical orbit, they don't need a massive amount of fuel to alter their trajectory and come home.
So it's a safe place to test things out.
And what happens in this waiting room is arguably the most critical technical phase of the mission. Every single life support and navigation system on board Orion must be meticulously stressed and verified.
They have to check everything.
Everything. They have to test the thermal radiators. They have to verify that the amine beds are successfully binding and venting carbon dioxide from the cabin air. They must test the star trackers that will guide them across hundreds of thousands of kilometers of absolute void.
Because the margins out there are zero. A tiny leak in a cooling loop, or a minor software glitch in a thruster controller here in Earth orbit, becomes a lethal, unrecoverable failure later on when they are 4 days away from a viable abort window.
Yes, the stakes are immense.
So they let the computers run exhaustive diagnostics, but they also have to perform a highly specific manual flight test.
Yes. The crew will actively take manual control of the Orion spacecraft's reaction control system, the small thrusters positioned around the exterior of the capsule.
Taking the wheel, essentially.
Right. They will physically rotate the spacecraft, manage the deadbands, and translate the vehicle back toward the upper stage of the very rocket that just launched them. They are practicing precise 6 degrees of freedom, maneuvering in the vacuum of space using human inputs.
Which sounds incredibly complex when you consider there is no atmospheric drag to slow you down. Every burst of a thruster requires an equal and opposite burst to stop the motion.
It's like flying on ice.
So why do they need to do this manually? We have algorithms that can dock spacecraft automatically.
Because the ultimate architecture of the Artemis program requires Orion to act as a deep space tug.
A tug?
Future lunar missions are not solitary, direct ascent endeavors like Apollo. They will require Orion to rendezvous and dock with other massive pieces of hardware, like the planned Lunar Gateway Station or the human landing systems, while in a halo orbit around the moon.
Oh, so lots of construction and docking.
Exactly. That requires absolute precision, and it requires a proven manual backup if the automated docking software fails. If the crew cannot demonstrate that Orion can be flown smoothly by human hands right now, in Earth orbit, the entire future logistical chain of the Artemis program collapses.
Now, think about the psychology of this elliptical checkout phase. If a sensor starts blinking red during this manual test, or if the CO2 scrubbers show a 2% drop in efficiency, the mission rules dictate they can end the flight early.
They can pull the plug.
They perform a burn, bring the spacecraft back to Earth safely, and the crew lives. But imagine the human pressure here. You have trained for years. You are sitting in the most powerful rocket ever built.
The whole world is watching.
The global media is watching. You are on the verge of making history. Isn't there an absolutely massive psychological temptation to look at a minor anomaly, dismiss it as a sensor glitch, and succumb to go fever just to keep the mission moving forward?
Go fever is the exact psychological trap that has led to some of the darkest days in aerospace history.
It's dangerous.
Very. The normalization of deviance, where a small anomaly is accepted because it hasn't caused a disaster yet, is lethal in spaceflight. That is why the strict operational discipline of Commander Wiseman and the flight directors in Houston is paramount.
They have to be ruthless?
The culture of a modern test flight is rooted in an aggressive, almost militant willingness to abort. You have to possess the institutional courage to scrub a multi-billion-dollar mission over a minor pressure drop, because in deep space, minor pressure drops compound into explosive decompression.
Wow.
The discipline required to say, no, we are ending this, is arguably much harder to cultivate than the courage required to launch.
It takes immense bravery to be the one who pulls the plug.
It really does.
But assuming all the telemetry is nominal, assuming the manual flight test is flawless, they reach a monumental threshold. As they approach the perigee of their final Earth orbit, Orion will perform the Translunar Invitation Burn, or TLI.
The TLI burn is the definitive point of no return.
This is it.
They ignite the main engine of the upper stage precisely when they are traveling at their maximum orbital velocity. By leveraging the Oberth effect, applying thrust when you are already moving at your fastest, deep within a gravity well, they maximize the kinetic energy gained from the fuel.
It's all about efficiency.
It is a sustained, violent engine firing that fundamentally alters their orbital mechanics. It increases their velocity to nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour, finally giving the spacecraft the sheer kinetic energy required to overcome Earth's gravitational grip.
And once that engine cuts off, the physics change forever. They are no longer orbiting Earth. They are officially on a translunar trajectory.
They're on their way.
They have left the neighborhood. And as they coast farther from Earth, trading that immense velocity for altitude, they are also escaping Earth's protection.
Which is a sobering reality.
It is, which brings us to the hazards of the void. Because the TLI burn introduces the crew to two entirely new, distinct threats, one psychological and one intensely physical. Let's look at the psychological hazard first, the shrinking of Earth.
We often talk about the overview effect, the cognitive shift astronauts experience when they see the Earth from low orbit, recognizing the fragility of the atmosphere and the absence of borders.
Right, that feeling of unity.
But the visual reality of deep space travel induces something much heavier. As the Orion spacecraft races toward the moon, the planet they just left behind begins to physically shrink in their windows.
Just getting smaller and smaller.
The vast continents become indistinguishable. The intricate weather systems blur together, and eventually Earth becomes nothing more than a small, fragile blue marble suspended in an ocean of absolute black.
For you and me, listening right now, Earth is the container for everything that exists. It is every place we have ever known, every person who has ever lived, every mountain, every ocean.
Yes, our entire context.
But for this crew, Earth will cease to feel like a place. It just becomes a distant, discrete object in the sky. You can cover your entire home planet, your entire species, with your thumb.
Just block it out entirely.
The deep existential isolation that must set in when your brain processes that visual data. It is a profound psychological burden that no human has carried in over 50 years.
It is the ultimate cognitive detachment. And simultaneously, as they experience this profound psychological detachment, they are undergoing a severe physical detachment.
How so?
Because for the first time in decades, a human crew will physically cross the boundary of the magnetosphere. They will leave the protective shield of Earth's magnetic field.
Down here on the surface, we don't think about it, but the Earth's molten core generates a magnetic field that acts as a massive deflector shield, protecting us from the absolute hostility of the cosmos.
It's our invisible armor.
Once Orion crosses the Van Allen belts and pushes out into deep space, the environment becomes exponentially more dangerous. They are suddenly exposed to the constant rain of galactic, cosmic, rays-heavy, high-energy particles traveling at near light speed from outside our solar system.
The ambient background radiation of deep space is a known quantity, and the Orion spacecraft is engineered with sufficient shielding to manage that baseline hostility.
Right, the baseline is okay.
But the environment is highly dynamic. The real acute threat occurs if our own sun decides to act up. The primary danger to the crew comes from solar proton events, often associated with coronal mass ejections.
If the sun flares and a wave of highly charged protons is blasted out perfectly aimed at their trajectory, the radiation levels inside the spacecraft spike dramatically.
It becomes a lethal, acute radiation environment.
And the emergency protocol for this is simultaneously brilliant physics and terrifyingly improvised. It immediately reminded me of building a childhood blanket fort, but with absolute life-or-death stakes.
The blanket fort analogy is so accurate. The physics behind it are actually deeply rooted in atomic structure.
How so?
If the space weather prediction centers on Earth detect a coronal mass ejection inbound, the crew has a very limited window to respond, sometimes just minutes. They cannot outrun a solar storm. Their only option is to physically alter the interior architecture of the spacecraft to increase the mass between their bodies and the incoming protons. They must move into a designated central bay inside the Orion capsule.
And they literally surround themselves with their own supplies.
Everything they can find.
They take storage bags of equipment, tightly packed clothing, and crucially, their water reserves. Anything with high physical density, they pack it around themselves.
Right.
Now, you might think, why not just line the ship with thick lead? But that actually makes it worse, right?
Exactly. This is the counterintuitive physics of space radiation. If you use heavy metals like lead to shield against high-energy protons, the incoming proton strikes the heavy metal nucleus and shatters it.
Oh, like a cue ball breaking the rack and cool.
Yes, and that creates a shower of secondary radiation neutrons and gamma rays inside the cabin. This is called spallation, and it is deadlier than the initial proton.
Wow, so lead is actually a hazard.
To stop solar protons safely, you need materials rich in hydrogen. Because hydrogen atoms are roughly the same size as the incoming protons. They absorb the kinetic energy cleanly, like billiard balls colliding, without creating secondary shrapnel.
Which is why water, food, and human supplies, all heavily composed of hydrogen-rich molecules, make the best emergency shielding.
They are using the molecular density of their everyday supplies to create a makeshift radiation bunker.
It is such a raw, visceral reality. You can engineer the most advanced avionics in history, but ultimately, your survival during a solar storm depends on how quickly you can stack bags of water around your torso.
It perfectly illustrates the sheer vulnerability of human biology in deep space.
But even if the sun remains quiet, the crew cannot hide from the absolute crushing isolation of reaching their destination.
No, they can't.
Because roughly 4 days into the mission, they will finally approach the lunar sphere of influence. And this brings us to the orbital mechanics that act as their ultimate safety net and the darkest, quietest moment of the entire journey.
The lunar flyby.
As we established, Artemis II is not landing. They aren't even firing engines to enter a stable circular orbit around the moon.
No.
Instead, the mission profile dictates that they will fly around the moon. They are going to use the immense mass and gravitational well of the moon itself to physically bend their flight path, using it as a massive slingshot to throw them back toward Earth.
This specific orbital maneuver is known as a free return trajectory, and it is arguably the most elegant piece of risk mitigation in the entire architecture.
Elegant is the right word.
It relies entirely on the immutable laws of a three-body gravity problem rather than on the reliability of hardware.
Let's explore the math of this because it is brilliant. The initial TLI burn back near Earth is calculated so precisely that it places them on a path where the moon's gravity vector will intersect their trajectory perfectly.
Correct. Once they are on that precise path, physics takes the wheel. The beauty of the free return trajectory is that even if the Orion spacecraft suffers a catastrophic failure halfway to the moon,
Like everything goes wrong.
If the solar panels fail, if the main engines completely die, if the critical flight computers lose power, the crew is not stranded in the void. They don't need to fire a single thruster to turn around.
The moon does the work.
The gravity of the moon will catch their mass, swing them around its far side, naturally flip their velocity vector, and hurl them back on a direct, unpowered collision course with Earth's atmosphere.
So it is truly that simple. If everything goes dark, if the cabin is freezing, they just drift for days in the silence, and the universe naturally brings them back to the doorway of their home planet. No steering required. It is math as a life preserver.
Math as a life preserver.
That's
Yeah, exactly. Now, practically speaking, returning to Earth dead in the water means you cannot fine-tune your entry corridor, which carries extreme risks of either burning up or skipping off the atmosphere, which we will discuss.
Right.
But the fundamental truth remains. The celestial mechanics guarantee you will return to Earth, regardless of whether your ship is generating power.
But to ride that free return trajectory, to utilize that lunar gravity assist, you have to pay a toll. You have to endure the far side of the moon.
The far side.
And the physics of this moment are deeply unsettling. As the Orion spacecraft passes behind the moon, a physical barrier of solid rock, thousands of kilometers thick, is placed directly between the astronauts and Earth.
And when that happens, the laws of electromagnetism dictate a terrifying reality.
What happens?
Radio waves operate on line of sight. They cannot bend around a planetary body, and they certainly cannot penetrate thousands of kilometers of lunar rock. As soon as Orion slips behind the moon's limb, they lose all communication.
Every single tether to humanity is violently severed.
No radio signals, no telemetry data flowing back to Houston, no friendly voices giving them weather updates or system checks. Total absolute silence.
For how long?
For roughly 45 agonizing minutes, the crew is completely, fundamentally on their own. They're on the far side of the moon, farther from Earth than any human beings have ever been in the history of our species. And they cannot speak to a single other soul.
If we consider the psychological weight of that silence, it is profound. You are in a small, pressurized metal container, relying entirely on the math of the free return trajectory.
Staring out the window at a heavily cratered, desolate lunar landscape that has never once faced the Earth.
The isolation is no longer just visual, it is absolute. You are completely cut off from the human race. You are the four furthest outliers of humanity.
It's hard to even imagine.
I want you to imagine the physical sensation of being in that capsule during the blackout. Just the sound of the life support fans humming, the breathing of your crewmates, and the knowledge that if something goes wrong right now, no one is coming to help.
Houston doesn't even know if you are alive.
But then, as the orbital mechanics drag them around the curvature of the moon, they slowly re-emerge from the shadow. Earth rises over the lunar horizon.
The radio crackles to life.
The telemetry signals reconnect, the voices from mission control return, and the long gravitational fall back home begins.
The return transit takes several days, and the crew doesn't just coast. They continue monitoring the systems, stressing the life support under long-duration loads.
Right, still gathering data.
They collect crucial biomedical data on how their bodies are responding to the prolonged exposure to microgravity and deep space radiation. Because this mission is as much about rigorous medical data collection as it is about aerospace engineering.
But all of that data, all of that science, all of the success of the lunar slingshot, none of it matters if they fail the final exam.
Re-entry.
Because the exact same orbital mechanics that so elegantly bring them home also create the final and unequivocally most dangerous hurdle of the entire Artemis II mission, hitting the atmosphere. This is the trial by fire.
The challenge of re-entry from deep space is fundamentally a problem of kinetic energy conversion.
Breaking it down, what does that mean?
When astronauts return from the International Space Station from low Earth orbit, they're moving at roughly 28,000 kilometers per hour. That is incredibly fast, but it is a known, highly manageable velocity.
Okay.
Orion, however, is returning from the moon. It has spent days falling back toward Earth, constantly accelerating as it falls deeper into the gravity well. By the time it approaches the upper edges of the atmosphere, it will be screaming toward the planet at over 40,000 kilometers per hour.
40,000 kilometers per hour. That number just breaks the human brain.
It's absurdly fast.
But the physical result of that speed is very simple to understand. When a physical object hits the thick gases of Earth's atmosphere at that velocity, it compresses the air in front of it so violently that the air physically cannot move out of the way fast enough.
It creates a shock wave.
That extreme compression generates unimaginable heat. The temperatures outside the Orion capsule will rise to nearly 2,700 degrees Celsius.
To put that thermal load into perspective, that is roughly half the temperature of the surface of the sun.
Half the temperature of the sun. That is terrifying.
It is hot enough to instantly melt solid titanium, let alone aluminum and human tissue. It is hot enough to instantly vaporize the spacecraft and everyone inside if that immense kinetic energy is not perfectly managed and converted.
I was trying to visualize the physics of this phase. It's not just hitting a wall of fire. You are using the Earth's atmosphere as a giant, invisible brake pad.
Yes, aerodynamic braking.
You are essentially trading your sheer speed for heat. You have to shed all of that 40,000 kilometers per hour of velocity simply by slamming into the air and letting the aerodynamic friction burn it off. And the only thing standing between the crew and instant incineration is the heat shield at the base of the capsule.
The heat shield is the single most critical piece of passive hardware on the vehicle. Its entire purpose is to absorb and physically dissipate that 2,700-degree heat.
How does it not just melt entirely?
It operates on the principle of ablation. The surface of the heat shield is coated in an epoxy resin material called AVCoat.
F-coat, okay.
As the heat builds, this material is designed to literally burn away. It sublimates, turning from a solid directly into a gas, and as it blows away from the spacecraft, it carries the extreme thermal energy away with it, creating a boundary layer of cooler gas that protects the metal hull.
It is entirely binary. It either ablates perfectly or you die. Throughout the rest of the mission, there are backups.
Right, redundancies.
If a thruster fails, there is a redundant thruster. On the launch pad, if the rocket fails, you have the violent escape of the launch abort system pulling you away. But during re-entry,
There is no backup.
if the heat shield fails to ablate, or if it fractures due to the thermal shock, there is no backup. There is no secondary shield underneath it. There is no abort system that can save you from atmospheric compression heating. It is just instant destruction.
It is the ultimate bottleneck of risk. Every single deep space mission, no matter how successful the transit, must pass through the crucible of re-entry. And during the peak of this heating, the air around the capsule is superheated into a glowing plasma.
More blackouts.
Yes, this plasma completely blocks radio signals, meaning the crew experiences one final, terrifying communication blackout while they are engulfed in fire, pulling crushing G-forces as the atmosphere rapidly decelerates them.
But assuming the heat shield performs exactly as engineered, assuming the ablation carries the heat away and the atmospheric drag slows the capsule down to subsonic speeds, the final mechanical sequence begins.
Parachutes.
As the capsule reaches the lower, thicker parts of the atmosphere, the parachute deployment must be perfectly timed to the dynamic pressure. First, the smaller drug parachutes fire out to stabilize the capsule's rotation and pull it into the correct orientation. Then, the massive main parachutes deploy. But they don't open all at once, right? They're reefed-held, partially closed, so the sudden drag doesn't just rip the canvas to shreds.
Correct. They deploy in stages, gradually opening wider as the speed decreases, catching the thick lower atmosphere, and gently reducing the capsule speed to a manageable 25 kilometers per hour. This violent, fire-soaked, plasma-shrouded descent ends with a slow, controlled splashdown in the waters of the Pacific Ocean,
Where Navy recovery teams will be waiting. They will approach this blackened, scorched, chemically toxic capsule, secure it, and bring the 4 crew members, who have just traveled farther than any human beings in half a century, back to the solid ground of Earth.
which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire endeavor.
The why of it all.
We've explored the incredible propulsion systems, the intense psychological profiles, the radiation hazards, and the ablative physics of re-entry. But why take this immense risk?
Right.
Artemis II is not about planting flags for the sake of national pride. It is not about setting records just to get a name in a history book. It is about proving a fundamental capability that is absolutely essential for the survival and expansion of our species.
It is about proving that flesh and blood humans can actually leave the protective bubble of Earth, travel through the incredibly hostile, irradiated environment of deep space, operate complex avionics under those extreme conditions, and return safely.
Because Artemis II is only the beginning. It is the mandatory prerequisite.
For what comes next.
Future Artemis missions aim to build a sustained presence on the lunar surface, to learn how to extract resources, how to shield habitats, how to live there, and ultimately, to use the moon as the proving ground for the technologies that will one day take humans across the vast, empty gulf to Mars.
The next giant leap isn't just visiting the moon again. We proved we could visit in 1969. The next giant leap is learning how to stay.
But none of that grand future, none of the lunar bases, none of the Martian transit vehicles can happen unless this specific mission, Artemis II, succeeds.
Right.
We are, for the first time in over 50 years, leaving the safety of the shoreline and heading back out into the deep ocean.
Which leaves me with a final thought I want you to mull over. We've spent this time talking about proving the titanium hardware and the biological endurance. But if Artemis II is successful, if we prove that our bodies and our machines can survive the deep space environment, and we do establish a permanent, sustained presence out there, how will human psychology and human society fundamentally change?
That's a huge question.
Imagine a whole new generation of space dwellers, people living on lunar stations or Martian colonies, for whom Earth is no longer the only home they've ever known. For them, Earth will just be that distant blue object hanging in their night sky.
Just another star.
Exactly. How does that visual shift change what it means to be human? Because right now, we are just dipping the submarine into the trench to see if the hull holds. But one day, people are going to live at the bottom. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
We will see you next time.